Thank you very much for your attendance today at the ACHPA 28th International Conference Fritz Duras Memorial Lecture. My name is Trent Brown and I'm the President of ACHPA Victoria. It's a great pleasure to see so many wonderful friends and members of the HPE community here tonight. It's been a real pleasure and honour in organising this conference and finally getting to the start line. Before we actually get started, there are a number of welcomes that I would actually like to do and thanks to be made. Let me start by welcoming the Duras family. So Fritz's children, Marianne, Peter and Michael. We've also got the spouses of Peter, Sue, and the spouse of Michael, Sandra, and their daughter, Annette. So we welcome you here tonight. I would also like to thank members of the ACHPA International Conference Committee. You have done a fantastic job getting everything up and running up until this point, and I wish you success over the next 3 days of the 28th ACHPA International Conference. I'd also like to thank Professor Field Rickards, the Dean of the Faculty of Education here at the University of Melbourne. Field has been a very ardent supporter of ACHPA Victoria and its endeavours during the last couple of years since I've known him, and he's supported the Fritz Duras lecture and also the Fritz Duras Memorial Lecture, and I'll let him explain a little bit about those two. So thank you very much, Field, for your support of ACHPA and ACHPA Victoria and this conference as well. There are also a number of VIPs that I'd like to welcome here tonight. These include life and fellow members of the association, also office bearers of both state and national associations. I'd also like to welcome Mr Graham Quelch, President of ACHPA National, Mr Dr Graham Dodd, Vice President of ACHPA National, and Mr Douglas Hearn, Vice President of ACHPA National, and also national board members. Can you put your hands together for them too? I'm also very honoured that Professor David Kirk agreed to give tonight's Fritz Duras Memorial Lecture. It's a great privilege to have such an esteemed colleague in the room. I'm really looking forward to hearing him speak, and I know that he's travelled from the University of Bedfordshire in the UK to actually give this lecture. So thank you, David, for actually agreeing to be part of this occasion as well. As part of this welcome, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of land on which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay our respects to the elders and to their families. Before I introduce Field Rickards, can we just make sure, please, that everyone's got their mobile phones turned off or on silent or vibrate as well. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Field Rickards, the Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Education here at the University of Melbourne, to the stage.
Trent, thanks very much, and good evening, particularly first of all to my friends, the Duras family. We catch up annually at the moment, but normally less often. But also to all ACHPA dignitaries, Professor David Kirk, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm delighted to add my welcome, and in particular to the Melbourne Graduate School of Education for this opening of the 28th ACHPA International Conference. I note with pleasure that this also marks the occasion of, as it says on the screen, the 22nd Fritz Duras Memorial Lecture. The first one having been given by Dr. Phil Law in 1968. I knew Phil Law well. He was a great supporter of sport at the University of Melbourne. Moreover, he was an Australian scientist and explorer who served as director of the Australian National Antarctic Expeditions from 1949 to 1966. I was given a list of all previous lecturers, all 21 of them. I won't tell you who they all were, but I will note two or three. The 1972 lecture was by Professor Zelman Cowan, a Rhodes Scholar who went to New College in Oxford and later became the 19th Governor-General of Australia. Sir Roger Gilbert Bannister gave the 1982 lecture. Of course, he was best known for running the first mile in less than 4 minutes, and in the 1952 Olympics in Helsinki, he set a British record for the 1500 metres. Senator Susan Ryan, for those Australians who remember, was the 1984 orator. She was particularly distinguished because she served as a senator for the ACT between 75 and 87 and served in several ministerial roles in the Hawke government. But I think the most notable one was as the inaugural minister assisting the Prime Minister of the status of women. And then, of course, the last one in 2011 was Professor Emeritus Alan Reid, and his contributions to education have been recognised in a number of ways, including being a gold medal winner of the Australian Council of Educational Leaders and was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2012 at the Australia Day Honours. So this is a distinguished lecture indeed. Now, as was hinted earlier, our graduate school has also formally recognised the significance of Dr. Duras's work. So in 2008, and given this is an odd year, and you'll notice that 2008 is indeed an even year, we instituted a regular Fritz Duras lecture as part of our own Dean's Lecture series. And that was to dovetail, as I've just suggested, in alternate years with this current lecture delivered at your biennial conference. We've had 3 of those lectures so far, and they've been given by Professors Richard Tinney, Joe Salmon and Doone MacDonald. Each, I think, in their own way have contributed to the conversation around health and physical education that's so important to the ongoing wellbeing for our communities. Fritz Duras was a renowned member of the Faculty of Education here at the University of Melbourne. He moved from Germany in 1937 and that move was facilitated by Professor G.S. Brown, a slightly older version of our Victorian president, who was then the Dean of the Faculty of Education. And he had the aim of establishing a course within the faculty to train teachers of physical education. Dr. Duras was a medical doctor specialising in sports medicine and was appointed Director of Physical Education. He was a pioneer in the field of physical education, this being the first course in physical education offered in any Australian university. In fact, his life was a series of firsts. He was also the first Vice President of the Australian Sports Medicine Federation. He was the first President of the Australian Physical Education Association. He was the first Australian to be elected Fellow of the American Academy of Physical Education, and he was the first President of the International Council for Physical Education and Sport. So it makes immense sense then that we're gathered here this evening to celebrate his legacy. Again, I welcome you all here to the university, where we continue to value the direction that Dr. Fritz Duras lay forth in Australia more than 75 years ago. So I wish you well in your conference, and I now hand back to the other Dr. Brown.
Thank you very much, Field, for those words. Most of you will realise that here in Victoria, where there are a couple of different people who are being involved in the organisation at the top end here. Myself as part of the organising committee, as I mentioned, for the conference, but we are also hosting the 28th ACHPA International Conference on behalf of ACHPA National. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce the ACHPA National President, Mr. Graham Quelch.
It's a bit of a procession. Thanks very much, Phil. Thank you for hosting. And it's great to see the Duras family again. And we're very close this time. Ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed an honour for me to be able to do the intro to Professor David Kirk. And you'll get the sense, for those of you, who's under the age of 30 in the audience? Anyone in the front 5? No, don't worry about it. Just have a look. Under 40? Okay, if you're not getting a sense, there's a bit of history in the room. Okay, and I think that's one of the things, we talked a little bit about that today in the forum that we had, which was fantastic. And if you were there, there was a vibe there that was fantastic. And it's continued and reflects the exuberance for life and everything to do with what we're in the business about that Fritz embodied. Professor David Kirk joined the University of Bedfordshire in June 2009 as the Alexander Chair in Physical Education and Sport. And the chair is named in honour of Eileen Alexander, who was the former principal of the College of Physical Education and founder of the Alexander Trust. In 2009 and 10, Professor Kirk was the director of the Institute for Sport and Physical Activity Research and is currently completing a term as acting director of the Institute for Sport and Physical Activity Research and Education at the same. He's held academic appointments in Australia between 1984 and 1998 at Deakin University and the University of Queensland, and from 1999 to 2005 at Loughborough University, where there's a proud heritage in our work there. Most recently, he was Dean of the Carnegie Faculty of Sport and Education and Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Research at Leeds Metropolitan University. He's currently visiting professor of the University of Queensland and was a guest professor at the Department of Sport and Movement Sciences at the University of, how do you say that in Belgium? Is it Ghent? Ghent, very good. Okay. Professor Kirk has been widely published and many of you would have read his work, and if you haven't, then you should. He was published widely on physical education and curriculum change and on youth sport. His program of research has four major strands: the social construction of physical education, sustainable curriculum renewal and physical education through models-based practice, young people's learning in school and community sport, dance and active leisure, and physical education, teacher education. All themes we crossed across again in our forum today. This lecture today builds on David's published historical research to consider how we got to where we are now in health and physical education in Australia and abroad, the issues we must consider in terms of where the field might be heading at this defining moment, and the choices we may have over the kinds of futures we might want. Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honour for me to welcome to the podium Professor David Kirk to present this year's Fritz Duras Memorial Lecture.
Good evening, everyone. Excuse me whilst I turn myself microphone on. I feel like two-gun Tex here. I've got microphones in each pocket. Hopefully I won't have to move very far. Let me find my notes. Can I just say straight away, I'm recovering from a cold. If I do begin to cough tonight, you don't need to feel sympathetic because I'm getting better, not worse, with some hope anyway. I'd like to begin by thanking the Duras family for their continuing support for this lecture. I'd also like to thank the ACHPA Life members and fellows for being here. There is indeed some degree of history in the room, which makes me very nervous because I'm sure that you're all going to correct my facts that I get wrong, but let's see how we go. The special guests of ACHPA and, of course, the conference delegates. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here. It's absolutely delightful, as well as meeting some new folks. Finally, I'd like to thank the organising committee of the 28th ACHPA International Conference for inviting me to give the lecture tonight. As an historian of school physical education and sport in Australia and the UK, it's an especially meaningful experience for me to be invited to give the 22nd Fritz Duras Memorial Lecture, and to give it here at the University of Melbourne, where Dr. Duras worked. It's been my conviction for some time, and something I've argued in public, that most of us in health and physical education do not know the history of our field particularly well. And this places us in a very precarious situation in terms of our readiness to face change. So it's a delight for me that ACHPA has continued to support this lecture in honour and memory of a great physical educator. I want to take the opportunity this evening to talk about this current time in health and physical education in its historical context, and to give you a sense of why it is that Fritz Duras thoroughly deserves the accolade of a memorial lecture. I really apologise for the very bad photo. If you get any better ones around that we can scan, I would really appreciate you sending them along. Dr. Fritz Duras is often called the father of physical education in Australia. I won't dispute that description tonight, but I will argue that if he was indeed the father, and to stay with the family metaphor, he was greatly assisted by Ma, the kids, and many of the uncles, aunts, cousins, and grandfolks, indeed much of the extended family. I will argue tonight that he was able to contribute to making a defining time for physical education between the late 1930s through the 1950s, to developments that continue to have a profound impact on what we do in the name of physical education today. Because he was able to make the best of the people, the events, and the resources around him. If I can communicate one single message through this lecture tonight, it is that we must all be involved, collectively and with one shared purpose, if we're to make the implementation of a new curriculum a defining time now for health and physical education. I can't see the slides, so I just want to make sure I'm staying on course here. I want to begin the lecture by asking what we might mean by the phrase, a defining time. Before elaborating on an earlier defining time, which focused on the national fitness campaign of the mid to late 1930s, in which Dr. Duras was a key figure. Returning closer to the present, I want to then ask who can do what to make this a defining time, and what might be the role of ACHPA and of individuals in this process. Finally, I will discuss how we might realise the legacy of Duras et al. And argue that there are at least 5 things the new curriculum must facilitate in order to contribute to a defining time now for health and physical education. With the theme of the conference, a defining time, it might be appropriate to begin this lecture with some reflection on what this phrase might mean, in particular, what we might hope for at such a time. Clearly, the phrase anticipates the implementation of a new national curriculum. To what extent is this a defining time, and what is it defining? To what extent can a curriculum document define a field of study, for example? As far as the document itself is concerned, if it's well written and forward-looking, then I think we can reasonably argue that it might, especially since it has, as it's reached the entire country, offer a definition of what physical education can be. This was very much the case with the 1946 syllabus Physical Education for Victorian schools, otherwise famously known as the Grey Book. The Grey Book presented a radically new vision for a whole generation at another defining time for Australian physical education, which I'll come to in due course. In this sense, a curriculum document can be aspirational since it seeks to bring into being something new, something that without it we would not be doing. It's a statement of what we will do rather than what we are doing currently. Though, of course, it's presumably seeking to build on the best of current and past practice. So the document itself can offer a definition of health and physical education, but by itself, it's unlikely to bring about any profound shift in practice. We know this from countless other curriculum development exercises over the years. Needless to say, the implementation of any new curriculum is complex. This we know from both the research literature in health and physical education and beyond, and from professional experience. So whilst a visionary curriculum document can facilitate this particular period of history as a defining time, there are other forces and factors that need to be in alignment. Just what it takes to make the aspirations expressed in the curriculum document a reality, we will come to in the course of this lecture. But there are some related issues around the notion of a defining time that we might wish to address now. While it's, in my view, appropriate and necessary for a curriculum document to be aspirational, we must be wary of the kinds of hopes we might reasonably expect it to hold for the future of health and physical education. We need to accept, I think, that there is no bright new tomorrow to which this curriculum will lead us. There is no future utopia for health and physical education. In my view, we need instead, when approaching questions about the future, to take a firmly anti-utopian stance, which in contrast to the bright new tomorrow style of thinking, seeks to take small steps to improve the life situation of specific groups of young people in specific contexts. We must ask the pragmatic questions of this curriculum. Can we make the situation for young people better than it is currently? What would be better? And how might we go about this task? If we are to ask, what can we reasonably hope this document might hold for the future of health and physical education, I propose it should be that all young Australians will come to value the physically active life. This notion of lifelong physical activity, as I've shown elsewhere, has been a commonplace aspiration of physical educators around the world, and indeed has been the raison d'etre of physical education's place in the school curriculum. It's an aspiration that, if we are to trust the many surveys of adult physical activity, we've spectacularly failed to achieve. Despite its ubiquity and a very poor track record in realising this hope for physical education, nevertheless, I want to argue along with Darryl Siedentop that if we could actually improve on the situation that currently exists, even in small increments, this would be a truly radical aspiration that could provide significant benefits to individuals and society. It's worth looking a little bit more closely at what Siedentop's original formulation of this notion involved. Siedentop explains this notion of valuing the physically active life as follows, and I do apologise to Darryl for this picture. I'm sure he was in mid-explanation of something, but it's the only picture I could find of him on the web. So he says, valuing physical activity is most clearly revealed not in what we say or write about it, but in decisions we make to arrange a daily or weekly schedule so that activity participation is possible, even though there are other important or attractive alternatives. He continues, although participation may be the key component in valuing physical activity, we must attend to a second component of valuing: willingness to participate in the sport, fitness, and leisure activity cultures in ways that are literate and critical. By literate, Siedentop means that persons are knowledgeable and active as cyclists, volleyball players, hikers, and the like. People should be knowledgeable about sport, fitness, and leisure, and be willing to use that knowledge as activist participants in helping to preserve, protect, and improve the practice of their activity. By critical, Siedentop means that persons should understand the structural inequities in their local, regional, and national activity cultures that may limit access to activity based on irrelevant attributes such as race, gender, and so on. Individuals should value fair access to participation so much that they're willing to work at local, regional, and national levels to make that activity more available to more people. Those of you who know Siedentop's work on sport education will immediately recognise two of the three learning outcomes from that model. For me, what's important about this definition is that it focuses on valuing, a verb that implies something deeper, more committed, and longer lasting than mere knowing or doing. Valuing the physically active life is also, according to Siedentop, dispositional. Part of what it means to value the physically active life is to habitually and routinely make time to be active, even in the face of attractive alternatives. And these notions of literacy and criticality are also important. Literacy points up the fact that there are things to know as part of the act of valuing. Moreover, criticality suggests valuing is not an individualistic act, focused solely on the self, but recognises social and physical cultural conditions locally and more universally, and the need for a collective understanding of barriers and opportunities to be active. Valuing the physically active life is highly consistent on my reading with the new curriculum. The rationale for the curriculum states health and physical education provides opportunities for students to develop the skills, self-efficacy and dispositions to advocate for and positively influence their own and others' well-being in creating a sustainable future. In the SHAPE document, students are to value learning in, about and through movement. Throughout the curriculum, competence, literacy and criticality are stressed as major learning outcomes in this field of health and physical education. I think it's important that we're able, as a diverse professional community, to have a clearly stated and shared vision for what we wish to achieve. To optimise the possibility of as many young Australians as possible valuing the physically active life provides a relatively easy to communicate aspiration. But the notion of valuing also reveals that this is a complex process, as the new curriculum itself testifies, that cannot be reduced to simplistic ideas. For example, I'm climbing on my soapbox here, moderate to vigorous physical activity, MVPA, as the main outcome of physical education lessons. It can't be reduced to those relatively simple notions. The aspiration is radical, I believe, not just because it's been hard to achieve, but because of the significant benefits it could bring to so many people in terms of the quality of their lives. But is it utopian? I would argue it's not utopian if we're clear about one thing, that this is an aspiration to work towards, rather than an end point to be reached. Moreover, progress is not about finding the common essence, something true and deep, as Richard Rorty would have it, that binds people together. The notion of valuing the physically active life is a point of focus. It's a touchstone for our professional community, but it's no more than this. As circumstances change in the face of global warming, worldwide financial crises, armed conflicts and pandemics of incurable disease, our focus may well change. It's a touchstone, no more, a priority for now and as far as we can foresee in the short to middle term future. It's also a complex, many-sided process that might move us towards a tomorrow that's better than today. The American pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty has described humanity's progress, pursuit of moral progress, as more like sewing together a very large, elaborate polychrome quilt, which involves using 1,000 little stitches, equivalent in our case to the many and various practices we as professionals in the field of health and physical education deploy to eliminate barriers to young people valuing the physically active life. So what are the 1,000 little stitches that might be sewn around the new curriculum if it's to assist us to make life better for as many young Australians as possible? Perhaps to assist them to value the physically active life as a lifelong commitment. If this is indeed a defining time for health and physical education, what other factors come into play that would indicate to us that there is an opportunity to hope, pragmatically, for a better future than the present? In the next part of this lecture, I want to turn the clock back to another defining time for physical education, to the late 1930s through the 1950s, in which Dr. Duras was a key player. Fritz Duras arrived in Melbourne in 1937 at a time of considerable ferment around the topic of national fitness. Indeed, his post at the University of Melbourne was a direct outcome of a survey of physical education provision in Victorian schools that was an important early contribution to the push for a national fitness campaign, sponsored by the National Council of Women in Victoria and the Australian Council for Educational Research. The report, published late in 1935, strongly supported the establishment of a specialist training course for teachers of physical education, a recommendation that the university acted on promptly. The Carnegie Corporation was in 1936 attempting to find employment for Germans exiled by Hitler's regime. Following considerable negotiation, Dr. Fritz Duras, a medical practitioner and sports scientist, as we've heard, who'd been dismissed in 1934 from his post at the University of Freiburg and had since relocated to London, was appointed director of the new course in physical education, his salary to be paid for 2 years by the Carnegie Corporation. The course began initially as a one-year certificate programme, but it was so popular with students that midway through 1937, Duras successfully negotiated with the University Council for a further year towards a diploma. This initiative, the coincidence of circumstances that made Dr. Duras available, and the fortuitous appointment of a man of his calibre to this post was a defining moment for the establishment of departments of physical education in Australian universities, which in turn, along with a range of other events I'm about to describe, created a pathway towards a new form of physical education in schools. In addition to this early initiative in Victoria, there was a wide range of other groups and individuals agitating the federal government to act on the question of national fitness. In 1937, William Hughes, former Prime Minister and at this time now Federal Minister for Health, set aside funds for health research to be administered by a newly created National Health and Medical Research Council. The first grants to the NH and MRC were approved late in 1937, and in 1938 the Council endorsed a series of resolutions concerning national fitness. There were other organisations pursuing national fitness goals too. The New South Wales government, for example, had formed a Physical Education Advisory Committee in 1937. In Victoria, the Age newspaper was vocal in promoting the need for a national fitness campaign and went as far as proposing how the campaign might work. Some of the other individuals and organisations expressing views on the topic of national fitness at this time were the Australian Natives Association, the Baptist Union of Tasmania, the Council of Churches in Victoria, historian C.E.W. Bean, the Australian Youth Council, physical culturist Mr. T.A. Langridge, the Recreation and Leadership Movement, the Australian Teachers Federation and the Health Association of Australasia, among many others. Given the diverse range of interests joined in debate, we should not be surprised that there were competing views on where the emphasis might be placed in any campaign for national fitness. One view expressed in Parliament by Prime Minister Lyons in 1938 was that national fitness should focus on nutrition rather than physical activity. Eugenicist ideas, which had somewhat gone out of fashion between the turn of the century and the late 1930s in Australia, were all of a sudden being taken seriously again. Meanwhile, in 1938, both the Returned Services League and the Australian Natives Association argued strongly for a military focus for national fitness and a return to compulsory military training in schools. The federal government response to this ferment was the establishment of a Commonwealth Council for National Fitness, which began its work in January 1939. By the time war was declared in September 1939, State councils for national fitness had been established in all of the states, and in Victoria, Dr. Duras was appointed to the council here. Funds were made available to appoint national and state organisers of national fitness. Grants to establish lectureships in physical education were readily accepted by the University of Melbourne, which no longer needed to rely on the benevolence of the Carnegie Corporation to maintain Dr. Duras, and the universities of Queensland, Adelaide and Sydney, whilst Tasmania and Western Australia accepted the grants as scholarships to send local students to courses in the other universities. The state councils were very quickly busy reviewing existing facilities and services, organising camps, volunteer training courses and flying squads of teachers to tour schools and offer instruction in physical education and sport. Dr. Duras's membership from the late 1930s of the boards and councils of a range of organisations, including the Victorian Association of Boys Clubs, the Youth Hostels Association Committee, and the Victorian Physical Education Association, would have greatly assisted with the integration of this work across the state. The National Fitness Act, passed by Federal Parliament in 1941, merely confirmed developments in mass physical recreation that were by then well underway. At the second reading of the bill, in June of that year, Minister for Health Sir Frederick Stewart noted that although in wartime fitness for survival was a prominent concern, he acknowledged the pre-war origins of the Act in his comment that we must not forget the ultimate goal of fitness is in order to enjoy life. A number of liberalising trends had already been underway in school physical education prior to Dr. Duras's arrival in Australia. Trends that were provided with additional momentum by the National Fitness Campaign. Between the First and Second World Wars, women such as Rosalie Virtue in Victoria and Ella Gormley in New South Wales worked hard to establish forms of physical training that involved less regimentation, especially for girls and younger children. In 1933, Virtue was emphatic that quick and informal methods of organisation should be employed. Drill has no place in the daily physical training lesson for schoolgirls. She was especially keen to utilise music to enhance the rhythmic qualities of movement, and she was a strong advocate of folk dancing as a key part of primary school physical education. Such was the popularity of folk dancing in primary schools across Australia that the State Councils for National Fitness began from the early 1940s to collect and print folk dances for use by teachers. And there were regular folk dancing radio broadcasts to schools from the late 1940s. This sort of innovative work of Virtue in Victoria and female physical educators in the other states chipped away at the orthodoxies of drilling and exercising during the 1920s and 1930s. It's no coincidence, given Dr. Duras's membership of the Council for National Fitness in Victoria, excuse me, that late in 1939, the Council was asked to investigate the status and deficiency of physical education and to furnish recommendations concerning future practice. Following its study, the investigating committee took what was to become a very influential view, as we'll see in a second, that physical education was an essential part of general education, and emphasised a need to shift from a perspective of education of the physical to a perspective of education through the physical. It's pure gin, in case you were wondering. One of the clearest expressions of the new physical education that was in the making was provided by L.G. Huck Hamilton in a series of articles that appeared in the 1941 edition of the Victorian Education Gazette and Teacher's Aid. Hamilton was at this time assistant to Rosalie Virtue and later was to become organiser of physical education in Victoria. He was, in addition, a member of Dr. Duras's third cohort of students at the University of Melbourne. In one article titled "Games Practice, Its Place and Value in the School," Hamilton advocated the idea that games were the means by which every child could be given an interest in physical activity, not just, as it was at the time, the socially privileged. He proposed that children should be taught to gain satisfaction from seeing their own improvement in performance and not necessarily from competing. Does this sound rather modern to you? He argued for a humanistic approach to physical education, where it must not be thought that the object of games practice is to produce champions in sport. There is a tendency in many large schools to concentrate on the instruction of the few already competent and gifted children, allowing this limited number to represent the school in inter-school competitive games. One of the chief aims should be to ensure that each and every child is given an opportunity to learn games and to become to some degree skilled in them. In this way, he is assured of a healthy physical exercise with a definite motivating interest. 1941. This rationale for a new physical education built on humanistic child-centred principles that had games and sports at its core was expressed in some detail 5 years later in the publication of a new syllabus for Victorian schools, a text that was also widely used in other states. And in fact, I've brought a copy with me. It's come home. This is the Grey Book. I'm happy for you to sign copies later if you come and see it. It was known as the Grey Book. Does anyone know why it was known as the Grey Book? I hear some muttering. It's the cover of the colour of the cover. It was in contrast to the Green Book, which was the 1933 British syllabus. I didn't bring one of those. It was getting a bit heavy in my suitcase. One of the purposes of the Grey Book was to break away from British influences in physical education by presenting material that was appropriate for Australian and Victorian schools. In the foreword to this new textbook, the Chief Medical Officer of schools, H.P. Kelly, contrasted the new physical education with the drilling and exercising form of physical training that the Grey Book sought to displace, arguing that formal exercises are artificial, unrelated to life situations, and generally lacking in interest. Kelly went on to map out the key dimensions of this new definition of physical education, in which enjoyment and enthusiasm are recognised as beneficial outcomes of participation in physical activity. This new textbook and the liberalised notion of physical education it promoted formed the basis of the work of growing numbers of specialist physical educators after the war. In 1944, 24 women and 6 men formed the staff of the physical education branch in Victoria. By 1946, these numbers had doubled to 60. And by the end of the decade, the staff comprised 74 men and women. This emerging body of specialist teachers of physical education very quickly saw their main role as developers of the skills pupils would use to participate in the team games offered by schools. Within this view of their role, physical education began to be positioned towards the end of the 1940s and into the 1950s as a foundation stone for children's participation in sport, as the site in which the skills required for sports participation should be developed. And for the first time, as far as I can discover in the historical literature, making an explicit connection between school physical education and lifelong participation in physical activity. One of the brochures advertising this conference asks the question of prospective delegates. At a defining time, what role will you play in shaping the future of health and physical education? Active or passive? On the face of it, this question seems straightforward. Will you get involved as a doer and make things happen, or will you sit back and let things happen to you? But as with many apparently straightforward questions, things are often more complex than this either-or choice suggests. In reality, what options do members of ACHPA and of the wider community of physical activity professionals have in order to make the implementation of the new curriculum a defining time for health and physical education? My purpose of the historical example was to suggest that the period leading up to and following the passage of the National Fitness Act of 1941 was a defining time for physical education that had a profound impact for the next 40 or 50 years. What made this a defining time? I suggest there are at least 4 reasons. First, new liberal ideas about the purposes of national fitness were accepted by government and began to gain purchase amongst professionals and the general public. Purposes that related to the quality of life rather than fitness for work, war, or breeding a superior race. Second, with these new ideas came a sport-based form of school physical education that superseded a former drilling and exercising form. Third, there was an influx into the field of trained teachers and organisers, with Dr. Duras's biographer Gertrude Kentish recording that in 1962, the University of Melbourne course alone produced 88 new teachers. And fourth, as an outcome of the Act, physical education as a field and education of physical education teachers was established in Australian universities. And it's no coincidence that these events took place just as Fritz Duras arrived in Australia. As I hope my historical example showed, Dr. Duras did none of this alone. Many other people were involved, some hotly contesting each other's values and ideas about national fitness. And the National Fitness Campaign itself experienced setbacks as well as triumphs. There's no question that Dr. Duras found himself in the right place at the right time for a man of his experience and abilities. So while he did not make the conditions into which he arrived, he made the best of them, working with other individuals and groups to sew together with many stitches a very large, elaborate polychrome quilt. Given the range of organisations he served, there's no question that Fritz Duras was an active contributor to change for the better. But then his position afforded him access which would have been denied others. At the same time, Kentish records many tributes to Duras's diplomacy, his tact, his ability to win support through discussion, persuasion, and compromise. And while the new physical education that was born during this era was undoubtedly a better experience for many more young people than the regime of drilling and exercising it replaced, many of the ideals that inspired it have not necessarily been implemented uniformly to benefit all young Australians of several generations that followed this defining time, which is something I'll come back to towards the end of the lecture. With the benefits of this lesson from history, what could be the opportunities for active participation in change that the new curriculum for health and physical education might make possible? And how can an organisation such as ACHPA and its members contribute to change for the better, particularly towards the aspiration that all Australians value the physically active life? The National Council of the Australian Physical Education Association voted at its annual general meeting in August 1970, held during the ICHPA APEA International Congress in Sydney, to change its name. And after a number of iterations, ACHPA was the outcome. The APEA itself was formed in 1954 with Fritz Duras as its inaugural president to provide national coordination and representation to the various state physical education associations. These, in turn, had been formed in the 1940s to represent the interests of the graduates of the new university programs of physical education, teacher education. As we noted, these programs were funded through a national fitness initiative which was broadly conceived across the fields of physical education, recreation, and health. Since they were so few in number in the early days through the 1940s and 1950s, the physical educators produced by these programs worked in each of these fields, though they were first and foremost physical educators. So the motivation to change the APEA's name to ACHPA acknowledged a long-term involvement of physical educators in these three fields. The Martin Report of 1964 on Australian universities caused considerable anxiety for physical educators, since it recommended the removal of all sub-degree programs from Australian universities and their banishment to colleges of teacher education. Bert Willee, a colleague of Dr. Duras's at the University of Melbourne and his successor as director of the Melbourne programme, responded to Martin that while it is true that the majority of physical education students become teachers, there are many who do not. And so for this reason, it was essential that the training of physical educators remained in the universities, where they could be exposed to a range of fields of knowledge, rather than transferred to teachers' colleges designed for no other purpose, claimed Willee, than to train teachers. At the same time, Willee's concept of a physical educator was rooted in the pre-1970s and pre-degree era. The consequences of the Martin Report were another defining time for the field of physical activity in higher education. ACHPA as an organisation came into being just as the degree decades of the 1970s and 1980s were beginning. An unforeseen consequence of the profound changes to the field wrought by this process was something for the most part unknown and probably unimaginable to men of Duras's and Willee's era: academicisation, specialisation, fragmentation. Writing in 1983 in a special issue of the ACHPA National Journal, Tom Thompson, for many years president of the Queensland branch and one of the two founding vice presidents of the APEA in 1954, wrote of the organisation's need for unity in the face of diversity. His analysis of ACHPA's mission recognised that the field it served had changed since the name change in 1971. He believed that diversity of interests and expertise was important to a professional body such as ACHPA, since it signalled vigour and growth. But he expressed concern that diversity could also become divisive and in the longer term lead to conflict and fragmentation. Unity was important, according to Thompson, because it gives strength to the organisation in terms of its ability to speak from a position of prestige and authority on public issues. Managing the tension between unity and diversity continues to be a major task for an organisation such as ACHPA. As I wrote with my colleague Doon MacDonald in 1998, we remain today as we were then, a profession in process. One of the ways that unity can be achieved in the face of diversity, I believe, is to identify the touchstones, the shared interests of the organisation, the things that we have in common rather than the special interests that make us different. One such touchstone, I've already suggested, is facilitating all Australians to value the physically active life. At an organisational level then, the identification of touchstones and securing the buy-in of all members is, in my view, an important action that could contribute to making this a defining time for health and physical education. One of ACHPA's strengths is that its members have expertise across the major physical cultural fields of sport, exercise and active leisure, with insights of pedagogical activities such as schools, after-school programmes, sports clubs, exercise, adventure and dance settings, and across the age range, from the early years to the elderly. Programmes that promote valuing the physically active life may take different forms in each of these fields, settings and age groups, but unity is to be found in the pursuit of common goals. It is within this context of unity and diversity, with unity focused on ACHPA's touchstones, that issues of representation and advocacy on behalf of members on the one hand and services to members on the other might best be managed. For individuals, my feeling is that the choice between taking an active or passive role while serving a helpful rallying cry is somewhat misleading. In order for this to be a defining time for health and physical education in Australia, an activist role is the only choice that's tenable. Part of being an activist is to recognise the touchstones within organisations such as ACHPA, to understand what the common ground means for me as an individual, and how my contribution makes a difference in terms of, for example, of helping others to come to value the physically active life. For individual activists, part of the process of recognising the common ground is also understanding the bigger picture of where my expertise fits alongside others. As I near the conclusion of this lecture, I want to argue that Fritz Duras's legacy and the legacy of that defining time of the late 1930s through the 1950s has yet to be fully realised. I think for all sorts of reasons, some good and some bad, many beyond our control as a professional community, the new physical education that was being shaped by Duras and his peers such as Rosalie Virtue and his students such as Huck Hamilton, expressed so eloquently in the Victorian Grey Book of 1946, has not taken the shape they might have hoped for. Yes, there was a fundamental shift in the field of school physical education from drilling and exercising to a sport-based curriculum. But as I've argued in my 2010 book, Physical Education Futures, the daily practice of physical education in many, although not all, schools is based on the teaching of sports techniques for the most part. This form of physical education, innovative as it was in the first few decades following the end of the Second World War, has rarely reached its full potential. And as a result, both here in Australia and elsewhere in the world, including the UK, physical education punches way below its weight in terms of assisting all young people to value the physically active life. So what can this new curriculum do to bring us closer to realising the legacy of this earlier defining time? I suggest for this document to be a catalyst in creating a new defining time for the physical education dimension of the field at least, and considering the body of research evidence that's accumulated in physical education and sport pedagogy for the last 50 years, it must facilitate several things. First, it must assist teachers to be student-centred. Drawing on the activist research of scholars who've worked with girls in physical education, such as Kim Oliver, Emer Enright and Jen Fizette, to be student-centred has at least 4 characteristics. It requires not just listening to student voices, but listening to respond, a preparedness to act on what we hear. Closely linked to this process of listening to respond is the disruption of traditional power relations and a willingness of adults to work with young people. A third characteristic is the investment of trust in young people, understanding that they have opinions, knowledge, and experiences that matter. A fourth characteristic of student-centeredness from this activist perspective is that it assists both teachers and young people to see beyond the obvious in order to imagine new possibilities, essential to maintain relevance in response to the fast-changing and increasingly interdependent worlds of digital technology and popular physical culture. Second, the new curriculum is right to place an emphasis on primary schools. This is not to say that physical education in secondary schools is no longer required, but it is to note that, for the reasons recently given serious recognition by a House of Commons Select Committee in the UK, age 12 is too late to be introducing young people to specialist teaching in physical education. This is particularly so for those young people who have limited access to junior sport experiences outside of the school, where school is their first and sometimes only point of access into the physical culture of Australian society. We know from research by US scholars such as Jackie Goodway that delayed motor development amongst under fives is most prevalent in poorer communities, and that these children, arguably the most in need, gain least from secondary school programs. And if primary school children receive a high-quality physical education, then there are, of course, serious implications for change in secondary school programs. Third, one of the unintended consequences of the new physical education as it took shape in the post-Second World War years was that physical educators sought to achieve a range of educational benefits from a multi-activity, one-size-fits-all sports technique-based curriculum. I believe the recent development of a models-based approach to physical education acknowledges the wide range of legitimate educational benefits that can accrue from physical education, where the subject matter and student-centered teaching learning strategies are tightly aligned with specific learning outcomes. A range of models already exist, and you'll know these: sport education, game sense, personal and social responsibility, and cooperative learning are some examples. There are some under development: health-based physical education, physical literacy for the early years, outdoor adventure activities, and a model for working with socially vulnerable youth in Santos, Brazil. A models-based approach, I suggest, can assist us to better work towards young people valuing the physically active life. And so it's important that the new curriculum can accommodate and indeed promote such an approach. If we're serious about young people valuing the physically active life, then a fourth factor is that physical education programs need to go beyond the school to reach into their community contexts, and communities need to reach into schools. Recognition of this issue featured in some of the developments in England during the last decade in association with the Physical Education, School Sport and Club Links strategy, and I'm aware that similar needs are perceived here in Australia. If valuing physical activity is something young people only do in school, particularly where there's little support for this in the home or local community environment, then it's unlikely to be sustainable beyond compulsory education. Last and not least, we must continue to recognise that teachers are vital to successful implementation of this new curriculum. Clark, in a book called Thoughtful Teaching, wrote, "Teachers are the human point of contact with students. All other influences on the quality of education are mediated by who the teacher is and what the teacher does." How teachers are educated initially accounts for part of what they do and who they are. But this doesn't account for the whole of what they do and who they are. We need to continue to recruit people who are able to inspire all young people, but particularly those from underserved communities, to value the physically active life. Such teachers will be enthusiastic learners themselves in the process of becoming better teachers. In terms of the issue of who we are as physical educators and this process of becoming, Fritz Duras said in his closing remarks at the end of the 1956 Pre-Olympic International Congress, "One question is usually asked when a congress such as ours comes to an end. What did we do? Today, let me ask a different question, more searching and perhaps more important. What did we become? Did we become more thoughtful? Did we become more aware of our problems, our tasks, our duties? Did we become more able to do justice to our profession? Did we become, and that perhaps is the deciding question, did we become more as human beings? Who teachers are and the ongoing capability to become more as human beings is often overlooked or forgotten in the bureaucratic and managerialist regimes that have recently infected education systems around the globe. But for the new curriculum to contribute to a defining time for health and physical education, we need teachers who have not lost sight of their qualities as the human point of contact with students. The people who knew Dr. Fritz Duras personally, such as his biographer Gertrude Kentish, and the individuals who provided her with testimonies to him, tell us that he was a remarkable man and a consummate physical educator. By remembering and honouring him in this lecture, ACHPA helps us all to understand that anything we achieve now and in the future is at least in part due to the fact that we are standing on the shoulders of giants such as Fritz Duras. I believe this could indeed be a defining time for Australian health and physical education. But a curriculum document, no matter how good, cannot create that defining time by itself. What's needed is leadership, activism on everyone's part, alignment of our efforts, a shared aspiration, and an understanding that change for the better happens in increments as we sew together with many stitches the polychrome quilt that is the field of health and physical education. We must ask, and ask again, the pragmatic questions of this curriculum. Can we make the situation for young people better than it is currently? What would be better? And how might we go about this task? Understanding that there is no nirvana at the end of the process, but a need to continue to meet new challenges and contingencies on the road to assisting all young Australians to value the physically active life. That, I believe, is the legacy of Dr. Fritz Duras and his many colleagues and friends. Understanding this legacy creates the possibility that this could be a defining time for health and physical education. Thank you.
He does what he's told, actually. It's very good. I've known David for some time, and I can recall conferences such as this where we would be sitting bright-eyed and bushy-tailed listening to people tell us to be activists, tell us to go out there and put what we feel in our gut into practice. And you've seen a bit of this today. And I think it's really important that those of us in the room who remember those days actually can give some to the younger generation as we come along. And David, you've done that today. I had a bit of dirt on him, but I'm not going to give any more dirt now. But it's not bad, though, for a fellow who's gone back to the motherland to come back here and tell us how to do our PE. And you've all been very, very thoughtful listening and nodding to him. The Duras family have really, I hope, got a touch and a feel for what Fritz was really about. And I know by the looks on your faces, this is something that I think he's touched on today. That in fact, Fritz himself, I believe, was a leader, but he was an activist. And there are many people that I could look at in the room today who have done that in their own way. I look at Barry Stanton. I look at Gary Powell. I look at Jeff Emmel. I look at David Parkin. And I'm sure I've missed a lot of people. Just examples of people who have gone out and helped people to value movement like you've told us today. I hope that the nirvana of this new curriculum coming out will be a defining time only if people make it happen. Only if we are activists. Only if we can actually get out and help people to value motion in their lives. And valuing human motion in our life is something that we can give to others and inspire others to give. And that's, to me, one of the great things about what you've said today. So, on behalf of us all, first of all, here's a book written by Gary Powell. Gary, will you stand up, please? This is a book written by him, and it's called Valuable Steps. And on the historical theme of today, it's the history of PE in Victoria. Now, Gary, he's getting on in years like the rest of us, was in fact a student of Fritz Duras. So he's one of the few people that can remember the gentleman you were talking about, who will come into focus one day. So, first of all, that's a book there.
Thank you very much.
And secondly, there's some wine that you can take back to the motherland, which you won't get in the motherland, that is from this land, from the southern part of this state, peninsula, that we haven't opened, so you're right, that actually gives us a hallmark of the quality, not only of that man, the quality of what we got here, but the quality of what you said tonight. So thank you very much on behalf of us all for a great speech.
Thank you, Graham, for that response. I think that that's a really important way of leaving the presentation that David gave tonight on activism. And I know that you're very much focused in on valuing human movement, and that was where your doctoral research was done, and you've published from that. And that's something that's driven, some of my work as well. And it's important that, we take the message about valuing in through and about movement in that way as we move forward into the implementation phase of the Australian curriculum. The next part of the night is a celebratory one, and I'm going to call on Graham Quelch to come out while I'm speaking. But one of the things that we like to do here within our ACHPA family is to celebrate the amazing contribution that a number of individuals have actually made to the organisation in different capacity. So I'm going to bring Graham up here to just have a bit of a brief introduction about this process, but it's a really important way of celebrating those activists within our ACHPA family. So, Graham.
Thank you. Oh, don't clap again. That was sensational. Well done, David. Thank you for that. It's appropriate at celebrations like this, and thank you, Trent, for the introduction, that we recognise the efforts of the activists and the promoters and the people that have gone above and beyond. Within the remit of ACHPA National, there are several levels of award that are able to be allocated, and they're typically nominated by state branches, by peers and colleagues, through a peer-reviewed process. You don't just get one for collecting Wheatie box labels or something like that. I know that there's other associations, you can pay a lot of money, you can become one, but for this one it's blood, sweat and tears. That's fair enough. And it's tradition at this forum that we recognise those that have been awarded in the period since the last one. The last time we met was in Adelaide, and there have been a few that have been awarded. There are 3 layers of national honours, and there are some that are here this evening. We're not going to present all of them, but there are some significant ones, and I want to recognise those people. So, first of all, the presentation of an award under the national honour, one called a national honour. Sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? Some of you people will be sitting, well, it's a phys ed thing, so you'll go with that. Like that. We don't hand these out lightly. They come around very rarely. And it took about 17 years for this chapter to earn this one. And the National Board thought it was highly appropriate that we recognised Jeffrey Emmel with the award of a national honour last year. I'd give you the wine or the book, but Kirky's got it. That's right. And the award was based around selfless service in the role of the National Executive Director of the organisation. I think we met on a bloody hot Saturday afternoon or somewhere out in Parramatta, and Len Enbury, many of you would know, warned me, he's not like the previous doctor. Bloody hell, he's not. Opening words were, Jesus Christ, Quelchy, it's hot, I hope you've got a bloody beer. There was a bit of a bond after that. Fortunately, I had a couple in the fridge, saved me. But since that time, and up to his eventual retirement at the end of last year, which kicking and screaming, not quite, and he often said, I wanted to leave as sharp as I was when I started. And I think it was the epitome of the activism, that undying passion for the organisation that hallmarked Geoffrey's work. The reason that he gets a national honour, it was actually one of the things around it, is he was actually paid to do that. Albeit a Jats cracker and a beer every now and then, really, I think. But 17 years of tireless service in the role, leading the organisation, has been honoured with a national honour. So, Geoffrey, congratulations. This guy right here, mate. How's that?
Thanks, mate.
Good on you.
Well done.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, the next layer of these, if you like, the next level of award is as a fellow. ACHPA fellows have made a significant contribution to ACHPA's standing and activities. They have served their branch with energy and commitment and been influential, hard-working and supportive of their colleagues in the workplace and within ACHPA's committees, projects and events. They have not necessarily been high-profile contributors, but they have made a significant difference over time to ACHPA's achievements. This evening I'd like to recognise, and I'm not sure if they're all here, so I'm just going, if you can stand, that would be great. If you are here, you can come down, because I do have some awards. Where's Megan gone? See you over there. Do you want to come out here? No show without punch. I made Megan and Rhiannon stand up at our forum today so everybody could realise where the engine room is in the organisation pretty much. And we'll see how we go. Okay, barrel girl. That's all right. Okay, so these awards have been since our last conference in April 2011. So if you're here, it'd be great. If you're not, we'll recognise you anyway. The Award of Fellow has been presented to Sky Gray from New South Wales. Oh, there we go, we can clap. To Professor Beth Hands from WA. There we go. To Dr. Karen Swaby from Tasmania. Is Karen here? No. You're going to have to be quick. You can see the applause gaps. You're going to have to really... To Dr. Marie Dinnan-Thompson from Queensland. Is Marie here? Yes, there we go. Yes, winner. Come on down. That one? Here we go. Some of these we're re-recognising in front of a national forum. Some of these folks already know that.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thanks very much.
Okay. That was in 2012. In 2012 to Dr. Sue Watman from Queensland. Is Sue here? Yes, another winner. There we go. Come bounding down. It's like the price is right. No. Congratulations.
Thank you, Courtney.
There we go.
Thank you.
There we go. Smile for one of those.
Thank you.
Okay, well done. Congratulations. Again in 2012 from South Australia, Toby Priest. Is Toby with us? Right in the back row. Congratulations. See, that's the back row habit, mate. You can't miss. Congratulations. Thank you. Congratulations. There you go. Well done. Thank you. Terrific. And our last one from Western Australia was Andrew Watt. I don't think Watt is here. Okay. Fabulous. The highest honour that we can bestow as an organisation is that of a life member. An ACHPA Life member has given outstanding service to their branch and to National ACHPA over many years. Life membership is the highest and most prestigious national award available to an ACHPA member. Nominations are considered and reviewed by an awards committee of peers representing all branches who ensure that the highest standards of professional conduct and merit are maintained to preserve the status of this honour. I'm delighted in this setting this evening, ladies and gentlemen, in front of this esteemed audience to be able to make 2 awards of this highest honour. The first one's a local boy, but I'm not sure if he's here. Is Dr. Jeff Walkley in the house? I'm not sure. But please, if you can bear with me, I'll read Jeff's citation. Jeff, you have made an outstanding and long-lasting contribution to the profession of physical education in Australia through your involvement with ACHPA over the last 18 years. Your contribution that you have made at both state and national level has been enormous, initially as a Vice President, Physical Education at the national level, whereas one of the distinguished 3, we'll have to find out who the other 2 were. Are they here? Maybe. You managed to lobby for a Senate inquiry into physical education and sport. This led to many positive outcomes for the profession, including increased presence in the media and increased presence of the ACHPA brand Australia-wide. At a state level, your contribution has been immense, initially at a board level and subsequently as president from 2005 to 2011. One of the most profound initiatives that you took during this time was related to the reorganisation of the governance structure, which those of us that have been involved in that know what a joyful process that is. No doubt he would have led it with skill. The move from an executive committee to a board structure was an important step in the growth of the organisation and set up subsequent boards to operate effectively. Furthermore, the intense lobbying on behalf of the branch to the Department of Education to secure funding as a partner is also worthy of major mention here. Your advocacy skills for physical education, profession and ACHPA, community, school, university and government level have been exemplary and had a significant impact. The sharing of your extensive knowledge and expertise has impacted on physical education via teacher ed and research, demonstrating your amazing commitment to ACHPA and its members. We thank you for your wonderful contribution. You are our most worthy recipient of the ACHPA Life Member Award. It's Dr. Jeff Walker. And I do know this next one is here, and he'll probably hate this, but I would like Dr. Shane Pill to make his way down to the front. You don't get this yet, you've got to suffer the citation. Relax, it's okay. Shane Pill, as an active ACHPA member since 1991, you've always been an enthusiastic and professional activist for the cause of physical education and its associated areas within schools, universities and the wider community. Both at work and in leisure, you remain a driving force for the area in all its forms and at all levels of education. You are an admired, dependable and energetic leader who has positively influenced the teaching standards and professionalism of many South Australian physical educators, and I might say recently also around the rest of the country. You have undertaken key roles within your organisation at both national and state levels, including chair of the 2011 ACHPA Conference Committee, ACHPA South Australian board member, and currently as ACHPA branch president since 2002. You were awarded the award of Fellow in 2007. You've also developed a range of highly acknowledged resources and support materials for educators. Your work continues to be epitomised by your dynamic approach to the teaching of physical education, which is characterised by your distinctive lateral thinking. Shane, your continued high-level professional commitment to ACHPA, physical education and associated areas is commendable. Your outstanding and ongoing contributions to the promotion of active and healthy living and to ACHPA at national and state levels make you a most worthy recipient of the ACHPA Life Member Award. Would you please acknowledge Shane? Thank you. That's the last one. Before we do that, one thing I've made a bit of a habit over the last couple is to ask the life members and the fellows in amongst you just to stand. Be proud. Would you join with me in recognising the life members and fellows of ACHPA? Thank you so much for joining us, Trent. Thank you so much for having it. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Graham, for the presentation of Life Member and Fellow Award presentations. That concludes the formalities for this evening. We do have some drinks and canapes and refreshments out here in the foyer here. But before we actually depart, I'd just like to thank for the final time our Fritz Duras Memorial Scholar, Professor David Kirk. I'd like to thank on behalf of the organising committee the support that we've received from ACHPA National and the National Board. To those VIPs, fellows and life members of the Association, office bearers and state and national associations, thank you for your attendance. I'd also like to thank Professor Field Rickards for the support that you've given ACHPA Victoria over the last couple of years in terms of the facility use and also the presentation in terms of the work that you've done for ACHPA. So thank you very much, Field. And I'd just like to thank all the delegates for coming to the lecture. There's a lot that I took out of David's presentation, as I'm sure that you have. For those of you who are staying around for the conference for the next 2 days, it's going to be great that you're going to be present here at the 28th International ACHPA Conference. I wish you all the very best during that time. And my final piece of housekeeping information is that if you've brought in food or drinks, can you make sure that it leaves with you out of this lecture theatre, please, so that there are no cups, mugs, glasses, anything that's left. So whatever's on the floor that you brought in with you, please take it out and put it in the bins. Thank you very much for your attendance, and we hope that you have, over the next couple of days, all the very best in your professional learning journey. Thank you.